So virtually every food that has inherent sugar has an equal amount of requisite fiber. Okay? If you did a scattergram between the sugar content and the fiber content of any given fruit, it would be on a diagonal line. Okay, so the more sugar, the more fiber. A perfect example of that would be sugar cane. It's a friggin' stick. You can't even eat the damn thing. You might be able to chew on it and suck some of the, sucrose out of it, but how much do you think you're going to get out of that? All right. But as soon as you mash it up and, crystallize it and put it in a centrifuge and, now you've got white powdered sugar, now it's a very different thing. All right. And we see this in other things, in other places in nature. Example, coca leaves. Coca leaves are medicinal, but cocaine is a drug. Opium poppies are medicinal, but morphine's a drug. Well, sugar is kind of the same thing. So the bottom line is, the process of purification, i.e. processing, okay, changes the qualities and the properties of various chemicals within food and turns them into something else. Now, sometimes we can harness that for good, like, for instance, 70% alcohol, to sterilize instruments, or, 46% alcohol to pickle your liver, after a, bourbon binge. You decide. So, you have to know what you're doing, and there's science in this story. And the concept of nutrition, that is, adding up what's in the food, is missing the entire point. That's why I want nutrition thrown out, into the garbage. Let's talk metabolic health, because that's what matters. The only reason to even study nutrition is to understand how to make people healthier.
Let's take the sugar piece and get a bit further into the nuance there. And specifically, if we're talking about sucrose or table sugar, and when that is added to processed food, how does our body handle that?
So to understand sugar, first we have to understand what we mean by sugar. Okay, what's the definition of sugar? Because different people have different definitions. So let's talk about that. When I refer to sugar, I am referring to dietary sugar, the sweet stuff. And that could be sucrose, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff, the crystals you put in your coffee, or high fructose corn syrup, or maple syrup, or honey, or agave. Now, all 5 of those are virtually identical. They come in different formats, but they're identical biochemically. One glucose molecule, one fructose molecule. Glucose and fructose are not the same. The food industry would have you believe they are the same. They say a calorie is a calorie, a sugar is a sugar. They are not the same. They are not even remotely close to the same. Now, glucose is a 6-membered ring, and fructose is a 5-membered ring. They are metabolized completely differently in the liver and in other cells as well. Glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. The Inuit, they had no place to grow a carbohydrate. They had ice. They had whale blubber. All right? They still had a serum glucose level. All right? And the reason was because the liver would take fats, which was high in whale blubber, and proteins, which was high in whale blubber, and it would be able to metabolize the amino acids in the proteins to glucose, or the fats in the whale blubber into glycerol, which then could be reformed in the liver to glucose, a process called gluconeogenesis. All right? So even when you don't consume glucose, your body makes it because glucose is so friggin' important. And if your glucose goes down to 0, you are dead. That's the only time that you don't have a serum glucose level is death. All right? Fructose, on the other hand, this 5-membered ring, is a whole nother ballgame, because there is no biochemical reaction in any vertebrate, in any animal cell on the planet that requires fructose for function. It is completely vestigial to all animal life. It is a holdover from our plant ancestors, okay? Because the plants like to store energy as fructose, and the plant can use fructose much more easily. And that's why it's fruit sugar, is because you find it in fruit plants. All right? You don't find fructose in any humans. So the question is, if there's no biochemical reaction that requires it, is it food? The answer is, well, actually, no, it's not food. It's energy, but it's not food. So what's the definition of food? The answer is substrate that contributes either to the growth or burning of an organism. That's a fine definition. That comes right out of the dictionary. I got no problem with that definition. Substrate that contributes either to the growth or burning of an organism. Well, it turns out fructose actually inhibits growth. My colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsonigo Ornan at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, has just published 3 articles in Bone Research demonstrating how ultra-processed food, and specifically sugar, inhibits bone formation, bone accretion. It's one of the reasons why fracture rates are going up in the United States. And it actually hijacks normal growth because it increases risk for cancer. In either case, it's not contributing to growth. And burning. Now, people always say, well, sugar's got 4 calories per gram, therefore it contributes to burning. Garbage. Total complete trash. It contributes heat if you are burning it in a bomb calorimeter. That's true. But we are not bomb calorimeters. The way we make energy and harness energy is through a chemical in our cells called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is how we capture energy from food and how we power the different processes inside cells. So anything that increases ATP would be food. Turns out fructose actually decreases ATP. It inhibits 3 separate enzymes involved in mitochondrial ATP generation. It inhibits AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, which is the first step on the way of taking fatty acids all the way through beta oxidation to make ATP. And lastly, it inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, CPT1, which is the enzyme that regenerates carnitine, which is necessary. It's the shuttle mechanism that gets fatty acids into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. The sum total of which means that fructose, i.e. sugar, dietary sugar, actually inhibits burning. So if something inhibits growth and inhibits burning, is it a food? Answer?
No.
So if it's not a food, what is it?
A food-like substance?
Well, it's definitely edible. It's definitely addictive. But is it food?
No.
It's poison. It's poison. And it actually detracts from metabolic health. And we have the data to show how and why. Because fructose drives liver fat generation, and that liver fat causes insulin resistance, and the insulin resistance causes chronic metabolic disease in all your organs. Basically, Alzheimer's is insulin resistance to the brain. Okay, heart disease is insulin resistance to the heart and arteries. Diabetes is insulin resistance of the liver. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is insulin resistance to the ovary, etc., etc. So Basically, anything that generates insulin resistance is going to make you sick. Well, that liver fat is what generates the insulin resistance. So that's problem number one. Problem number two with fructose is it causes the aging reaction, known as the Maillard reaction, or the Browning reaction, also known as non-enzymatic glycation. So, to explain this process, it's why we paint barbecue sauce on our ribs before we put them on the grill. All right? It's the cause of cataracts. It's the cause of wrinkles. It is the cause of aging. And turns out glucose does this. In fact, when it does it to a hemoglobin molecule, you get a compound called hemoglobin A1C, and that's what diabetics measure to find out how their glucoses have been fluctuating, right? And the higher that number is, the quicker you die, because the more aging you will have undergone. That's true. Turns out fructose does that reaction 7 times faster than glucose. So it causes that aging reaction even faster. So it's ultimately leading to demise that much sooner. So that's the second problem. And then the third problem is it's addictive. It actually stimulates the reward center in the same way that cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, gambling, pornography, social media, internet gaming do. All right? There's only one reward system. There's only one set of neurons that make dopamine, but there are a whole bunch of different things that stimulate them. But ultimately, everything that stimulates dopamine in the extreme leads to addiction. That's why there's an aholic after every one of those things that I just mentioned. Shopaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, sexaholic, etc. All right? Well, there's sugarholic too. Because sugar in the extreme is also addictive because it stimulates that reward center.
Okay, let me pause you here and just get a little bit into the weeds. So actually summarize a little bit for myself and for others. So there's 3 different reasons why fructose isn't good. Bad for our metabolic health, ages us quicker, and it's addictive. So when we're talking about this, are we talking about, so just again to go a little bit summary here and higher level, we're talking about sucrose breaking off into glucose and fructose. We're talking about the fructose part of that for these negative reactions.
That's right. So the glucose is not great for you, but it's a walk in the park compared to what fructose does. So glucose can cause the Maillard reaction. All right? You can overwhelm your liver with glucose and still make liver fat, but you have to work at it. I mean, you have to really work at it. Can be done, but it ain't easy. But glucose is not addictive. Right? I mean, glucose is molasses. You don't see people going around chugging molasses, do you? All right? You don't see people chugging Karo syrup, do you? Well, so glucose is not all that sweet. It's sweet, yeah. I mean, yes. All right? Might be good in a molasses cookie. But, in and of itself, it does not stimulate the reward system. It does not stimulate the nucleus accumbens. It does not give you the zing. It's the fructose that gives you the zing.
And again, I'm going to pause you right here because I think we need to explain one thing before we move forward as well, in that we're talking about in an isolated sweetener form here because fruit has fructose in it.
Sure.
But then that comes back to we open the conversation talking about the fiber piece.
Exactly.
That fits into this and changes the whole dynamic there.
Right. So when you consume fruit, it's true you're consuming fructose. I don't argue that, okay? Fructose did pass your lips. Fructose did land on your tongue. Yes, you did generate a sweet signal. Yes, your brain, interpreted that as a sweet signal. The question is, did you absorb it? Did you absorb that fructose? Turns out, because of the fiber in the fruit, you didn't absorb it. It stayed in your intestine because of that gel we talked about. And so it went further down the intestine, and then the intestinal microbiome, the bacteria, chewed it up for its purposes because it loves fructose too. So even though it passed your lips, even though it registered as a calorie, even though it registered as a fructose molecule consumed, ultimately it did not register as a fructose molecule absorbed. And if you didn't absorb it, then guess what? It wasn't metabolized. And if it wasn't metabolized, guess what? You didn't eat it. So even though you ate it, you didn't eat it. Okay? You didn't get it. And so this concept of nutrition that you can total these things up is basically garbage. All right? It's subterfuge. It's the way the food industry basically gets away with putting anything they want in the food or not, and making you think that it's fine, and it's not.
We talked about a lot of different sweeteners there when we went into fructose, and it seems, at least in the health and wellness space, certain ones get a pass and certain ones are looked down upon. And things like honey or maple syrup, those are looked at like, okay, that's in a healthy dessert, that's kosher, that's cool. Talk about the continuum and how is there any difference when they get into the body and
Right.
start acting within the physiology?
Right. So honey is very complicated. Okay, there's a whole host of people out there that are saying that honey is good for you. Number one, there are no double-blind placebo-controlled trials demonstrating that honey is any different from sucrose. The reason that honey is sweet is sucrose. Okay, but people say, oh, but it's got vitamins and flavonoids and micronutrients, etc. Prove it. Prove it does anything. There's no data that shows it proves anything. Same thing with maple syrup. People say, oh, it's natural, it comes from nature. Yeah, that's true. Okay, but you know what? So does sugarcane. It comes from nature too. Okay, it's what's done to it afterwards. So that in and of itself is not a saving grace in and of itself. All right, and ultimately, the good thing about honey and maple syrup is they're more expensive, so people tend to use less of them. They also have their own flavor profile of their own, and so people tend to use less of them. And anything that causes you to use less of a sweetener, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing. Now, people say, I am anti-sugar. I am here to tell you, Jesse, right now, and your entire audience, I am for dessert. I am for dessert. For dessert. I am not for dessert for breakfast, lunch, snacks, and dinner. And that's what we have today. Example, breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal is dessert. If any form of sugar is one of the first three ingredients on the nutrition facts label, that's dessert. And for several of the breakfast cereals that are out there, sugar is the first ingredient on the nutrition facts label. Kellogg's Honey Smacks are 56% sugar. All right? That's dessert. That ain't no cereal. You get the idea. Okay? Ultimately, lots of things are dessert that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Yogurt is dessert. Chinese chicken salad is dessert. All right? And so you have to think of it that way. Ultimately, we have a limit as to how much fructose we can metabolize. Hey, we have a limit as to how much alcohol we can metabolize. We have a limit as to how much branched-chain amino acids we can metabolize. We have a limit on how much various drugs we can metabolize. Our liver, is the detoxification organ. But there is no poison on the planet that, that can't overwhelm your liver's capacity. The dose determines the poison. Now, it just so happens that for sugar, we have a higher inherent capability of metabolizing than, say, we do for cyanide, or we do for VX gas, or we do for arsenic, or we do for cadmium, or we do for benzene, or we do for carbon tetrachloride, or any of the other toxins that are out there in our environment today. So we have a slightly better metabolic profile for fructose than we do the others. But ultimately, there's a limit. And that limit is about 6 teaspoons per day for men. 9 teaspoons per day for men, 6 teaspoons per day for women, and about 3 to 4 teaspoons per day for children, and 0 teaspoons per day for toddlers and infants. That's the American Heart Association who says that. All right? Well, we are quadruple over our dose. So the question is, what does that do to your body? What does that do to your brain? That overdose. And is it just calories or is it specific? And I'm telling you, it's more than just calories because of these three processes: the liver fat, the Maillard or Browning or glycation reaction, and finally, the addiction phenomenon.
So just to clarify there, you gave some different numbers for different parts of the population, which would be an acceptable load of sugar for a day. So when we talk about that, that's above and beyond having fruit. That would be like, say there's some honey in a natural granola or a natural yogurt somebody's having.
Right. So obviously there's endogenous fructose in fruit. There's endogenous fructose in various other, components of our diet. But for the most part, those come with inherent fiber, and therefore you're not going to absorb all of that. When we talk about dietary sugar, pretty much the overwhelming majority of the sugar in our diet is added sugar, added by the food industry specifically for its purposes, not for yours, because they know when they add it, you buy more. That's their job. And they've learned over the course of time that there's almost no limit to how high they can go. And so virtually all of our food is overloaded with sugar on purpose because it's addictive. And the food industry's learned that. If they could add cocaine to the food, they'd do that, but they can't. So they found a legal addiction.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
It's poison. And it actually detracts from metabolic health. And we have the data to show how and why. Because fructose